The Tuskegee Airmen.
Triumph in the air and tragedy on land. Prior to World War II, segregation existed between white and black Americans. Black men could not get comparable jobs with white men, and the U.S. military viewed black soldiers as inferior and intellectually incapable of mastering the complex skills of flying military aircraft. During World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen triumphed over the "black man is inferior" stereotype. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that blacks could master the technical skills associated with combat and earn the respect of the white airmen. Tragically, after World War II, these men returned to their country to witness civilian discrimination and segregation as prevalent as before the war began. Slavery existed in the United States more than 200 years before the Civil War. Racial segregation in its modern American form started in the late 1800s. Jim Crow segregation laws were adopted by many southern states during this period. These laws segregated black and white people on railways, buses, public waiting rooms, restaurants, boarding houses, theaters, public parks, and the U.S. military. Also, separate schools, hospitals, and other public institutions, generally of inferior quality, were designated for blacks. Segregation continued during World War II as well as after the war.
At the beginning of World War II, many people believed that the United States would be drawn into the war, so the country started training more troops. Military leaders needed a supply of young men to fly fighter planes, bombers, and other aircraft. However, the U.S. Army Air Corps did not accept African Americans. A U.S. military study, along with several generals, concluded that blacks were not skilled and lacked the courage to fly modern military aircrafts. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces, received memos insisting that black personnel should not be military leaders fighting in active combat. Due to political pressure, the War Department announced in January 1941 that African Americans would be allowed to become pilots in the U.S. Air Corps. The military trained the first black pilots in Tuskegee, Alabama. Hundreds of high-qualified applicants came pouring in to earn their wings. 13 cadets started in the first class, with 5 successfully completed the training. By July 1942, enough African Americans had earned their wings to comprise the 99th Fighter Squadron. 3 additional fighter squadrons, the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd, completed training and were activated soon after. The airmen were eager to enter the war, but they did not see action because there were still people in the military that believed that they couldn't fly.
A visit by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt brought a breakthrough for the Tuskegee Airmen. Eleanor questioned why the Tuskegee Airmen were not participating in the war. After continued effort and support from Eleanor, the War Department initiated orders to send the 99th into combat. When the 99th arrived in Europe, they thought that they would be pilots fighting Adolf Hitler from the skies. Instead, they found themselves performing close, tactical ground support duties. On February 2, 1943, the 99th was deployed to the southern part of Italy, where they were soon introduced to live fire in the skies over Sicily. Their tremendous success led to their new mission of fighter pilots escorting American bombers on missions over German targets. The 99th joined the other 3 fighter squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd, to form the 332nd Fighter Group. The Tuskegee Airmen escorted their bombers to Austria, Hungary, Romania, Germany, and Poland. The white bomber pilots named them the Black Red-Tailed Angels for their stellar reputation in the sky and for the painted red tails of their planes. The 332nd Fighter Group was the only group in history that never lost a bomber that they escorted. The Tuskegee Airmen flew a total of 1,578 missions. They shot down or damaged on land 409 German aircraft, they destroyed 950 ground support units, and they sunk 1 German Navy destroyer. Dr. Charles Moskos, military sociologist from Northwestern University, speaks of the triumphs of the Tuskegee Airmen.
The triumph of the Tuskegee Airmen was that they performed magnificently in combat operations, and a very, very elite group. It wasn't just ground combat arms, but you're talking about pilots and who have to be mechanically and engineeringly trained as well as being good in combat zones. So that was an unmixed blessing. In terms of the standing of blacks in the American military.
Even though the Tuskegee Airmen triumphed in the skies, the armed services of the United States were still severely discriminatory and segregated.
The Tuskegee Airmen were proud of their aviation triumphs, but they still had segregated barriers to break. Trying to break these barriers, 162 black officers took part in an event that would jeopardize their military careers. These black officers demanded lawful entry into the White Officers Club in Freedman Field, Indiana. These officers were given the option to sign a pledge agreeing to be segregated, or they would be placed under house arrest and given a reprimand that would be part of their military record. 101 black officers refused to sign. Fighter pilot Mr. Hiram Little gives us his first-hand account on his refusal to sign the agreement for a segregated officers club.
But I said, well, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm not going to sign it. So I didn't sign it. He said, well, you consider yourself under arrest, you go back to your quarters, you stay there. I went back to my quarters and I stayed there for, I think, 13 or 14 days.
This tragedy became known as the Freedman Field 101 incident.
On May 6, 1945, the war in Europe ended. The Tuskegee Airmen's return to the United States was a far different return than the whites. After the African American pilots stepped foot on U.S. soil, they were quickly reminded that they were still considered second-class citizens. President Harry S. Truman attempted to desegregate the armed forces, and he succeeded. President Truman issued Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948. This executive order declared that there should be equality of treatment and opportunity for all those in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. Tragically, the Tuskegee Airmen's accomplishments were overlooked for 4 decades. The Tuskegee Airmen triumph in World War II had a tremendous economic impact on breaking racial barriers that eventually opened up better job opportunities for minorities. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that blacks were just as capable intellectually as their white peers. The Airmen's accomplishments led to significant political impacts as well. For example, President Truman's Executive Order 9981 eventually paved the way for desegregation in civilian life. Colonel Alexander Jefferson of the 332nd Fighter Group gives his opinion on the political impact the Tuskegee Airmen had in the desegregation of the Army Air Corps.
And the Army Air Corps has admitted it's wrong, and discrimination has been overturned. I thank old man Truman for having the guts enough to take his pen and Executive Order, what was it, 99 whatever it was, to desegregate the armed forces.
The Tuskegee Airmen's record of performance stimulated and inspired black men and women's abilities to make social and cultural impacts. This empowered their culture to pursue education and better job opportunities. The Tuskegee Airmen's social impacts were evident when the armed forces became desegregated. This eventually helped end segregation in civilian life. The Tuskegee Airmen's triumph helped open up opportunities for women, both black and white.
Ironic. White women are the ones who, I believe, profited more out of all the things. We would never have today Hillary or, who knows, Condoleezza Rice. Albright was the former Secretary of State. The world is changing. Thank God for the United States and all of it stands for. God bless the States. Still the best country in the world.
The training of the Tuskegee Airmen was an experiment established to prove that blacks were incapable of operating expensive and complex aircrafts. 992 black pilots graduated from the training program, 450 of whom served in combat. Although the Tuskegee Airmen faced discrimination and were treated as second-class citizens, the Tuskegee Airmen excelled in combat and were true American heroes.